Senna heard about the dead handler the same way she heard about most things in the lower district, from a water carrier who had heard it from a laundress who worked the spire tier's servant entrance. The man's name was Dorev. He had worked with Imperial dragon hatchlings for 11 years. He was dead in under a minute. The whelp that killed him was 3 weeks old. Nobody in the lower district cared much. Dragon business was dragon business. Senna went back to changing the bandage on old Petra's leg and did not think about it again until the guards came for her that same evening. There were 2 of them, full Imperial scale armor, the dark green kind that meant direct assignment from the court. They did not knock. They opened the door to the ward, looked at the 3 patients inside, and asked which one was Senna Vale. She raised her hand the way a child does in school. One of the patients laughed. The guards did not. They walked her up. That was the word people used in the lower district, walked up. It meant the spire tier. It meant you had been noticed by something large, and being noticed by something large was never good. The spire tier at dusk looked like the inside of a forge. The stone was dark red-gray, and the channels of heated air that ran through the floor made everything shimmer slightly at ground level. Senna had never been above the middle district in her life. She kept her eyes forward and her hands loose at her sides and breathed through her nose. She was brought to Councillor Yessa Fenn's receiving chamber, which was large and cold in the way that rooms are cold when they are built for creatures much bigger than the person currently standing in them. Yessa was behind a stone table the size of a door. She was reading something and did not look up immediately, which Senna understood was meant to make her feel small. It mostly worked. When Yessa finally looked up, she did not greet Senna. She laid out the situation the way you'd explain a blocked drain. The Empress Renova had died in labor 6 weeks ago. 4 whelps had survived. They were housed in the Imperial hatchery in the upper spire. They had already killed Dorev and put a second handler in the healing ward with burns across 40% of his body. No dragon nurse in the court would accept the post. The whelps were not eating consistently. The eldest was destroying the walls. Yessa said the word eldest the way she'd say the word problem. She told Senna that the court had identified her as a suitable candidate for reassignment. Suitable meaning expendable. Senna understood that without being told. She asked one question, what set off the eldest? Yessa stopped. It was a small stop, just a beat, but Senna caught it. The counselor said she did not know. Senna asked if she could see the hatchery logs before she started. Yessa said someone would bring them. Then she told Senna she would begin the following morning and dismissed her. Senna was given a room in the servant quarters of the spire. It was small and smelled like mineral oil. She sat on the edge of the bed and did not sleep for a long time. She was not thinking about the whelps yet. She was thinking about her brother Bren, who would come to the ward tomorrow morning and find her gone, and would spend 3 days asking questions before anyone told him where she was. She was thinking about the note she should have left him. She was also thinking, quietly and without drama, about her son. He had not had a name yet when she lost him. He had been 22 weeks, and she had delivered him herself because she was a midwife and she knew how, and knowing how had not helped even slightly. That was 7 years ago. She had gone back to work 8 days later because there was nothing else to do. She was 34 years old. She had set broken bones in children, delivered Barbies in rooms with dirt floors, and once sat with a man for 6 hours while he died slowly of a lung infection because he had no family and she was not willing to let him go alone. She was not brave. She was not special. She was just the kind of person who stayed when staying was hard. She picked up the hatchery logs when they arrived under the door at midnight. She read them in the dim lamp light until her eyes hurt. The eldest whelp had been the first to hatch. The records noted, almost as a footnote, written by someone who clearly thought it was irrelevant, that the Empress had still been alive at that point. She had died during the delivery of the second whelp while the first was already out of the shell. The first one had been awake when she went still. Senna put the logs down. She sat with that for a long time. Then she picked up the small supply list she had been drafting and added 3 things to the bottom. Heavy cloth in dark colors, something warm that could be left and retrieved without interaction, and a request for any item that had belonged to the Empress that could be spared. She did not explain why on the list. She did not think Yessa would understand the explanation. In the morning, she walked up to the hatchery door, and the guard posted outside looked at her the way people look at someone walking off the edge of something. She nodded at him. He stepped aside. She opened the door herself. That part mattered to her, though she could not have said why. She went in. The smell was the first thing, ash and something sweeter underneath it, like wet stone after rain. The hatchery was bigger than she expected. The ceiling was high enough that the far end of the room faded into shadow, and the walls were carved with deep alcoves on both sides, each one large enough to curl up in. 3 of the 4 were occupied. She did not look at the alcoves yet. She looked at the center of the room, which was empty except for the ring of iron braziers keeping the air warm. She counted them. 8. She noted where the vents were in the ceiling. She noted the water trough along the east wall, which was full. She noted that the floor near the largest alcove was heavily scored, deep gouges in the stone, the kind made by claws dragged across the surface over and over. Something packing, something that couldn't stop moving. She set her bundle down in the center of the room and sat down beside it on the floor, cross-legged, low to the ground. She had learned a long time ago that when something is frightened, you do not stand over it. She could feel eyes on her from the alcoves. She did not look. She opened the bundle and began laying things out slowly. Cloth, meat portions wrapped in linen, a smooth stone she had warmed near the brazier in the hall before entering, a strip of dark fabric that had been found in the Empress's chambers, one of the nest-lining strips Renova had gathered before she died. It had taken Senna 20 minutes and 2 written requests to get that strip. It was the most important thing in the bundle. She set it to one side, where it could be smelled from the alcoves without being in the way of anything. Then she started talking. Not to the whelps, not really. She talked the way she talked to patients in the ward who weren't fully conscious, not expecting answers, not performing comfort, just filling the silence with something that wasn't a threat. She described what she was doing as she did it. She described the meat portions, the temperature of the room, the sound the braziers made. She talked about the weight of the cloth in her hands. She talked about the ward in the lower district, the way mornings sounded there, the smell of the river market 2 streets over. She did not know if any of them could understand her words. She suspected at 3 weeks old they probably couldn't. But she knew, from years in small rooms with frightened things, that tone carried when meaning didn't. After about an hour, she heard movement, soft, careful movement from the second alcove on the left. Then a head appeared, small, pale-scaled, with eyes too large for its face, a whelp watching her from the edge of its alcove. It did not come out, it just looked. Senna did not look back directly. She kept her eyes slightly to the side, on the middle distance, the way you avoid startling a cat. She kept talking. She described the stone she had brought. She set out a portion of meat about 4 feet to her left, where it was closer to the alcoves than to her, and went back to sitting. The pale-scaled whelp came out eventually, cautious, belly low to the ground, every step placed carefully. It ate the meat in 3 fast bites and retreated immediately, but it didn't go back into the alcove. It sat at the edge and watched. 2 more came out over the next hour, curious rather than hostile. Senna let them circle her at their own pace, kept her hands visible and still, and did not reach for any of them. The 4th alcove stayed dark. She was aware of it the whole time, the scored floor in front of it. The silence coming out of it, which was a different quality of silence than the rest of the room. When she placed the Empress's fabric strip, she set it down slowly, maybe 8 feet from that alcove, equidistant, not an offering exactly, just a presence. She didn't look at the alcove when she did it. She went back to the center of the room, sat down again, and waited. Nothing happened. The afternoon light through the upper vents moved across the floor and then faded. She was still there when the evening guard came to check. He looked through the vent slit and found her sitting in the center of the room with 3 whelps within arm's reach of her, alive, unbothered, and eating her second portion of travel bread. She heard him leave quickly. She assumed he was going to tell someone. She stayed until full dark. Then she stood slowly, repacked what she wasn't leaving behind, and walked to the door. She paused before she pulled it open and looked back at the fourth alcove. There was a shape in it now, visible in the low brazier light, curled tight, facing the wall, but the fabric strip was gone from where she had set it. She had not heard it move. She went out. The guard outside was new. The first one had been replaced with someone who kept staring at her like she had done something unnatural by surviving. She ignored him and went back to her room in the servant quarters and wrote 2 lines in the small notebook she kept in her coat pocket. The eldest took the cloth, did not approach. Tomorrow, don't look at the alcove directly. She closed the notebook and slept better than she had expected to. 2 weeks in, and Senna had stopped counting the days by number. She counted them by what changed. The pale-scaled whelp, she had named her Ven in her notebook. Privately, a name she did not use out loud, had started sleeping near the center of the room instead of her alcove. The 2 middle ones, both gray-green and nearly identical, had begun competing for the portion of meat closest to Senna, which she understood as a kind of progress even when it looked like fighting. The vent observation slots on the east wall were never empty anymore. She could hear the shift changes, hear the scrape of scales on stone as one guard replaced another. She had started to find it almost funny. The fourth whelp, the eldest, Tail, though she didn't know his name yet, the hatchery logs had listed them only by hatching order, was not funny. He was not hostile either, exactly. He was something harder to read. He was present now in ways he hadn't been at the start. He had moved to the front of his alcove. He watched her. When she put out the meat portions, he waited until the others had taken theirs, and then crossed the room in about 15 long, precise steps, ate quickly, and returned. He never looked at her directly while eating. She understood that behavior. It was the behavior of something that needed to be able to stop trusting quickly. She did not push. She had never pushed. She added things to his alcove at the end of each day: warm cloth, a second smooth stone, a piece of iron she had found in the supply room that held heat well. She left them and left. The next morning they had always been moved. On the 15th day, she was tending to a crack in Ven's right talon. The small ones were still getting used to walking on hard stone, and the edges wore down wrong when she heard the packing stop. She did not look up. She kept working, kept talking in the low, steady way she had developed, explaining what she was doing and why, and she felt the air change slightly the way it does when something large moves closer. Tail stopped 2 feet to her right. She could see his feet in the edge of her vision. He was not doing anything, he was just there. She kept working on Ven's talon. She described the crack, described the treatment, described what she expected to happen in 3 days. Tail did not move for the next 40 minutes. When she finished and sat back, he was still there. He looked at her once, directly, and then turned and walked back to his alcove. She wrote in her notebook that night, he came to watch, not to attack. Took him 2 weeks to decide it was safe enough to be curious. Don't rush the next step. What she did not write, because she didn't know how to, was that she had cried on the walk back to the servant quarters, not from relief, from something she didn't have a clean name for. She had been in the room with his grief for 2 weeks, had watched it move through him in the packing, in the way he held his body, in the way he ate so fast it looked like he was afraid the food would be taken from him. She recognized all of it. She had done all of it herself 7 years ago in a different kind of room. She was not his mother. She was very clear with herself about that. But she understood him in a way that had nothing to do with species or scale or fire. The political side of things, which she tried not to think about, arrived in her room as a written notice on the 17th day. Councillor Yesser had submitted a formal review request regarding her methods. The notice was politely written and said almost nothing directly, which meant it was saying something very specific to whoever knew how to read it. A young dragon aide named Korev had been assigned to deliver her supply requests and had started, over the past week, adding small helpful notes to the return slips. Things like the kitchen will send warm portions if requested separately, no need for the linen wrap. He was maybe a year past hatchling himself, by the look of him, too young to have fully learned to treat humans like furniture. She asked him, when he came the next morning, what the review notice meant in practical terms. He was quiet for a moment in the way young people are quiet when they know the honest answer is not the safe one. Then he said, "Counselor, yes sir, expected you to be gone by now. She had a plan that needed you to be gone." Senna thanked him. He left quickly. She went to the hatchery that morning and sat down in the center of the room. Ven came to her immediately. The two grey-greens followed. She put out the portions and started talking. She heard Tail leave his alcove before she saw him. He crossed the room and ate without rushing this time. Then, instead of returning, he sat down about 3 feet away and stayed. He did not look at her again, but his breathing slowed after a few minutes. He was resting, in her presence, for the first time. She kept talking, kept her voice even, did not make it a bigger moment than it was. But she wrote it in the notebook that night in letters slightly larger than usual. He stayed. The summons arrived on the 23rd day, written in gold ink on black stone paper, which was how the Imperial court said, "This is not optional." Senna read it twice. She folded it carefully and put it in her coat pocket next to her notebook. Then she finished treating the small cut on one of the grey-green whelp's chin, because the summons could wait, but an open wound near a hatchling's face could not. She told Korev to let the hatchery know she would be back in the afternoon. He looked at the black stone paper in her hand, and his crest went flat, which he had learned meant he was worried. She told him she was fine. He looked like he did not believe her. The walk to the throne chamber was the longest walk she had taken in the spire tier. The corridors were carved from mountain rock, lit by iron lanterns, and completely empty of everything except size. The Empire put a lot of effort into making you feel small before you arrived anywhere important. She arrived feeling mostly tired. The throne chamber was open on its north face to the mountain air. It was the kind of cold that lives in high places, thin and sharp. The court was present in the way courts always are, bodies arranged in positions that were designed to tell you exactly how important each person was. Counselor Yessa stood near the left column. She looked, Senna thought, like someone who had already won. Emperor Dravosh Velkarath was at the far end of the chamber. She had seen him from a distance twice, through the spire tier windows. Up close he was simply old, not in the way humans got old, in the way stone got old, like the weight of time had compressed him into something very dense and very still. He looked at her for a moment, then he asked her to come closer. She walked forward until she was 15 feet from him, which seemed right. He was seated on a low platform, not a raised throne, which surprised her. He asked her without preamble why she thought the whelps responded to her. His voice was measured. He was not performing at her. He seemed, actually, to want to know. She took a breath. She said, "I think because I didn't need them to be anything. I wasn't trying to train them or manage them or make them presentable for anyone. I just came in and stayed. And when you're frightened and grieving, someone who stays without wanting something from you, that's the rarest thing there is." She stopped. Then she said, because she was tired and the thin mountain air made it hard to be careful, they lost their mother while they were still in the shell. The eldest was awake when she died. He wasn't aggressive because he was dangerous. He was aggressive because he was 3 weeks old and he had already learned that things disappear without warning. He was just trying to not be surprised again. The chamber was quiet. The court did not shift or rustle. Even Yessa was still. Dravosh was still for a long time. Then he said, "You are describing my son." She said, "Yes." He looked at her with something she could not fully read, not gratitude, not approval, something more uncomfortable than either of those. Recognition, maybe, the kind that costs something. Yessa's voice came from the left column. She said the rearing codes were clear. Imperial heirs were to be raised by dragonkin. She said this carefully, the way you handle something sharp. Senna looked at Yessa Fen. She had been looked at by Yessa several times over the past 3 weeks, and each time she had felt the weight of genuine contempt, not the careless kind. The kind built from real belief that humans were less and that the order of things was correct, and that any deviation from it was a kind of disorder. She understood that kind of certainty. She had sat with enough dying people to know that certainty was often just fear, that had been held for so long it forgot what it was afraid of. She did not say that. She said nothing at all, because it was not her place to answer yes, sir, and she knew it. Dravosh told yes, sir, that the codes would be reviewed. He said it mildly, like it was a small administrative note. Yes, sir's crest moved, but she did not speak again. The Emperor told Senna she could return to the hatchery. He said he would have a decision regarding her post within the week. She nodded, turned, and walked back the way she came. She did not rush. In the corridor outside, away from everyone, she put her hand against the wall and stood there for a moment and breathed. That evening, Korev passed her a folded piece of paper under her door. It was from her brother Bren. She did not know how he had managed to get a letter into the spire tier. She suspected Korev. The letter was short. It said that he had lit a candle for her every day since she was taken up, that the whole lower district knew what she was doing, that people were talking about it in the market and at the well, that someone had painted something on the wall near the east gate, though he didn't say what. She folded the letter and held it for a while. Then she put it in her coat pocket with the notebook and the black stone summons, and went to sleep with three things close to her chest that mattered in different ways. The Emperor came to the hatchery before sunrise. No announcement, no guards. Senna heard the outer door and was already awake. She was always awake before the whelps now, had arranged her palette so she could see the room's full width from ground level, could catch the first signs of Tail's bad mornings before they moved from restlessness into something harder to manage. She had not planned for this. Dravosh stood in the entrance and said nothing. He was not armored. He looked, without the ceremony of the throne chamber, simply enormous and uncertain, which was not a combination she had expected to see on something that had existed for 300 years. Tail was shifting in his alcove, not yet awake, but moving toward it. The transition between sleep and waking was the worst window, the place where whatever lived in him at the bottom came closest to the surface. Senna held up one hand toward the entrance without looking at the Emperor. Wait, not a command, she would not command him, but a request, and clear. He waited. She turned toward Tail's alcove, crouched low, and began talking. She described the morning, the temperature of the room, the sound of the braziers, the weight of the dark before sunrise. She talked about the river market smell that she missed. She talked about the time Bren had broken his wrist falling off a fence when he was 9, and had refused to cry and refused to let her treat it, and then cried for 20 minutes the moment their mother was out of earshot. Tail's movement slowed. He made a sound she had started to recognize, low, rough, like something settling. He came to the front of his alcove and looked at her, and then looked past her at the entrance and went still. She said quietly, without turning, "Come in slowly. Stop when I stop talking." The Emperor came in. She watched Tail track him across the room. The three others were waking now, and the energy in the room changed the way energy always changes when something with real power enters a space. The gray-greens pressed together. Ven made herself small. Tail did not press himself into a corner. He stood at the front of his alcove and looked at his father, and his father looked at him, and neither of them moved. Senna said, "Let him come to you, don't go toward him, and don't look directly at him the whole time. Give him somewhere else to put his eyes." The Emperor of Vorath, who had ruled longer than the current human district had existed, turned his gaze slightly to the side. He waited. Tail moved, not fast, not aggressive, slow and deliberate, the way he moved when he had decided something. He crossed the room in stages, stopping twice, reading the air each time. He came close enough to be within reach of his father and stopped. He sniffed once. He sat. He did not go closer than that, but he did not leave. Dravosh was quiet for a long time. Senna had settled back onto the floor, close enough to be a constant, far enough to not be in the middle of something that was not about her. The other three whelps had relaxed and gone back to their own business. The room felt, for a moment, like it had in her first week, like a place that was finding its own balance. The Emperor said, quietly, "I have not been in this room since Renova died." She did not say anything. She let it be. He said, "I had them move me out of the hatchery logs after that. I told myself it was administrative. He paused. I could not look at them. Senna said, that makes sense. He looked at her. She thought he might say something about weakness or grief being inappropriate to admit, or the way dragon society discussed these things. He said none of those things. He said, you are very strange for a human. She said, I get that a lot. It was almost a smile, not quite, but something near it. Tail had not moved from where he sat during all of this. He was watching his father with the same expression he had turned on Senna in the early days, not trust, not warmth, just the specific attention of something making a long decision. She thought, that is exactly what you look like. She did not say it. When Dravosh finally left, an hour later, he paused at the door and said without turning around, Councillor Yes's petition has been denied. You are under Imperial protection, effective from this morning. The rearing codes are under formal review. She said, thank you. He said, I want to come back tomorrow, if that is acceptable. She noted that he had asked. She thought about the man in the throne chamber, surrounded by a court built to reflect his power back at him, who had never once been in a room where he needed to ask permission for anything. She said, come before the braziers are lit. It's better in that hour, calmer. He nodded, he left. Tail watched the door close. Then he walked to where Senna was sitting and stood over her for a moment. He lowered his head until it was roughly level with hers. He did not put it in her hands. He did not ask for anything. He just stood there, breathing, until she started talking again. She described the morning light as it started to come through the upper vents. She described the sound Ven made when she was happy. She described the first day she had walked into this room and sat down on the cold stone and tried to fill the silence with something that wasn't a threat. Tail closed his eyes. She kept talking. 3 months after Senna first walked through the hatchery door, the Dragon Council met to decide what to do about her. She was not in the chamber. She was in the hatchery, where Ven was chasing a loose fire coal across the floor, and the two grey-greens were fighting over the warmest spot near the central brazier. Tail was lying with his head across Senna's feet, which he had started doing 11 days ago and showed no signs of stopping. She had given up asking him to move. She heard about the council meeting from Korev, who delivered her morning supplies and left a brief note under the wrap of the meat portions. The way he had started doing whenever something was happening above her head in the political levels she couldn't see. The note said, today, formal session, Marat is speaking. Marat had come to her 3 weeks ago. She had appeared at the hatchery door, large and angular and clearly uncomfortable, and said she wanted to speak with Senna directly. She had come in. She had sat on a crate, which was the only thing in the room besides the floor that was sized for her. She had looked around at the 4 whelps in various states of eating, sleeping, or wandering, and she had been quiet for a long time. Then she said, I refused this post. I want you to know I understand what that means now. Senna said, I know you refused it. Marat said, I was afraid. I told myself I refused because the situation was hopeless, but I was afraid of failing at something in front of the court. She paused. You were not afraid of failing. Senna said, I was afraid of everything. I was afraid every single morning when I walked in here. She looked at Tail, who was watching Vun from across the room. I just wasn't willing to let it be the reason. Marat had been quiet after that. She stayed for another hour, watching. She left without saying much else. But she had clearly said something to someone, because the formal review of the rearing codes had moved from announced to active within the week. The council meeting lasted most of the day. Senna did not wait for news. She fed the whelps, treated the small-scale split on the grey-green she had started calling in her notebook, and spent the afternoon sitting in the low afternoon light reading aloud from a repair manual she had borrowed from the Spire maintenance room. It had been useful once when she couldn't find anything else to read, and the whelps didn't care what she read, only that she kept talking. Tail had fallen asleep on her feet by the time Carve appeared at the door with a sealed note in Imperial gold. She read it once, then she read it again. Warden of the Imperial Hatchery. It was a title that had not existed before. The note explained this briefly and without ceremony, in the way that official documents tried to make extraordinary things sound ordinary. It also noted that a formal delegation from the lower districts would be permitted into the spire tier the following morning to visit. She folded the note and sat with it. She was still sitting with it when Bren arrived the next morning with 6 other people from the lower district, a midwife, a carpenter, 2 lubkas, an old man who had been a cartographer before his hands got bad, and a girl about 16 who nobody had explained. They came in through the main servant entrance, escorted by Curve, who looked like he was trying very hard not to let on how significant this was. Bren stopped in the hatchery doorway and looked at his sister on the floor, with 4 dragons arranged around her in various sleeping poses, and he looked like he was trying to find a word for something that did not have one yet. She said, "Close the door behind you, the draft bothers tail." He closed the door. He sat down on the floor next to her the way he had always sat beside her when they were children, without asking if there was room. He looked at the whelps. He looked at Tail, whose eye had opened at the draft and who was now examining Bren with the long, slow attention of something still deciding. He asked, "Are you all right?" She said, "I'm tired, but yes." He asked, "What happens now?" She thought about it. What happened now was that there was a review, and that reviews took a long time, and that the people in that council chamber had spent centuries being certain, and certainty was not a thing that moved quickly. What happened now was that Yusuf-Fen was still in the court and still believed what she believed, and that the lower district still had its gates and its classifications, and that one human woman being given a title did not change the architecture of an empire overnight. She said, "I think something started. That's what I know." Bren nodded. He reached into his coat and handed her a folded cloth. Inside it was a piece of bread from the baker on the East Street, the one with the seeds she liked, still faintly warm from the morning. She ate it. Tail's eye had not closed. He was still watching Bren. He was not moving to get up. He was just watching, the way he had watched Senna in those first days, that same long look that was not trust yet, but was something before trust. The part that comes when you have decided to keep watching instead of looking away. The cartographer, who had been standing by the wall and looking around the hatchery with the careful attention of someone making a mental map, said quietly to no one in particular, "I thought it would be bigger in here." Senna said, "It felt bigger at the start." The old man smiled. One of the grey-greens had moved to investigate his boots. She looked around the room. The whelps, her brother, the people from below who had never been allowed above, standing in a chamber carved into the mountain's highest tier, looking at the Emperor's children like they were things worth looking at rather than things to fear. Something had started. She stayed in it like she stayed in everything. That had always been enough.